Hi everyone, I'm Miss Lydia from the Boston Library. Thank you so much for joining me for our Craft Friday project. Today's project is going to be fairy houses. So you're going to need some supplies for this one. This project involves having a birdhouse or a small structure of some sort. It doesn't have to be a birdhouse. And it can be any shape. This just happened to be the kit that I had on hand. So I put it together and I glued it in place so that I have a strong, sturdy structure to work off of. From there, you can go out into your lawn or into the woods and gather some other supplies. So for my fairy house, I'm going to use some sticks that I've gotten. I have pine cones that I'm going to use for my roof. And then I gathered a bunch of moss. So I've got a couple of different types of moss that I'm going to use on my fairy house. Lots of stones. So those are going to be for my walls. I also think that I will throw in some seashells and some sparkly stones to add a little bit more interest into it. One of the things that I'm going to do is, because I don't really want this to look like a birdhouse, I want it to look like a fairy house, I'm going to cover up that hole in the middle. So I have a big gemstone here that I'm going to use, and I'm going to glue that in so that it looks like a window instead, and then I'm going to build my door underneath. So I would recommend using hot glue. It's probably your easiest bet for this project. Once you have all of your supplies gathered, you can lay it out on some newspaper to protect your work surface, and then you want to think about what materials you want on which surface. So I'm going to start with my roof, and what I'm going to use for my roof is parts of the pine cone. So depending on what type of pine cones you're using, you want to watch out. Some of them do have some really sharp spikes on the end. So without sticking your finger on those, you can take them and just wiggle it side to side, and then you're going to get like the end of the pine cone there. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this all apart so that I have my roofing material, and then I'm going to use it basically like tiles across the back. I've glued down my first layer, and what I'm going to do is work by staggering the pieces now. So I'm going to add my next layer, overlapping the first, and going in between the joints so that I get full coverage. And then I'm just going to continue working my way up, just like that. Found that it's easiest if you don't want to run a whole line of hot glue because it'll dry before you can use it. So if you just do a dot of glue and then stick down your tile. The nice thing is that fairy houses don't have to be perfect. A little bit of imperfection is kind of a nice thing in them. They make them look more woodsy and rustic. It took a little while, but I finished my roof. So you can see I've glued all of my pine cone pieces on there. There were a few pieces in the birdhouse that stuck up, so I glued some over there, those pieces as well. And you can see that it kind of blends in then. You want to make sure that you do overlap your edges. So you can see that I took my pine cone pieces out over the edges. And then you can clean up all the little glue strands that are left over. And I went ahead and I glued in my gem in the hole in the front. And next thing I'm going to do is outline my door. So I'm going to make a rectangle here in the front. I'm going to use a marker to mark that out. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. So I just want to get kind of an approximate shape to go for. You can do an arch too. I've seen a bunch of them with arches. And then I'm going to take my sticks, so you can see I'm going to have a door right there. I'm going to take the straighter sticks that I found, and I'm going to break those to that length. And then I'm going to glue all of those pieces in. So I'll hold it up and break it. And I'm going to lay this out as I go too, so I know how many pieces I need. You can use scissors too. It might make it a little bit easier, but these sticks break pretty easily. And then I'm just stacking them to see how many more I need to do. Now I'm going to try to stack them pretty close together, so I probably still need a few more pieces. For some more straight pieces here. The other thing I'm going to do, just so that my lighter color doesn't show through, I'm going to take my marker. It's black, you could use a brown marker too, and I'm going to color in my doorway so that even if I don't get these perfectly lined up, you don't see the background. So think I have enough sticks there. Set those aside, blow the dust off, and then I'm going to color this in. My door is now complete. You can see, if you want to, you can trim those ones up with an X-Acto knife or some scissors if you can get to them. I kind of like the way it looks. So I'm going to move on to my walls. So I have my stones here and my seashells and my stones like these. I'm going to begin on a side just so I can kind of get my bearings, get a sense of how I want to lay them out, and I'm going to try to cover all of the surfaces. The nice thing is, and part of the reason that I grabbed the moss, is that if I have any gaps that I can't fill with the stones, I'm going to use the moss to tuck into those spaces. So I'm going to start right off with, I might take a bigger rock to start and try to fill it into a corner. Now, because you're using stones, you want to make sure that you're getting a lot of hot glue down on there. And you can just work your way up. You might have to kind of mess around with which stones fit where. And then you also might want to check as your glue is drying, just make sure that everything is staying on there. So there's my beginning. I'm going to just continue with that same process, working my way all the way around. I've finished my fairy house. I've added a couple of little final touches to it, and that includes a little ladybug up on the top and a tack as my doorknob. So I'm going to go through and show you what I did with the different spaces. You'd seen the door was finished up. I did actually cut across the top of that to get a straight line so that I could fit my rocks right down onto that. And then I basically just worked my way around and I glued in the rocks as closely together as I possibly could. It does take a little bit of time to mess with where you're putting each rock. The spaces that I couldn't fill with the rocks, I used little twigs to cover the edges. So right around the corners, I used those twigs to cover that space. And then when I got sick of putting my rocks on, and also because my house was getting pretty heavy, I used the rest of that space for my moss. So I took the moss, I knocked the loose dirt off of it as best I could, and then you put down a ton of hot glue and just stick it right to the side. So you can see I've done that there, and then I liked the way it looked across to the top, so I left a little bit of it hanging down along the edge there to cover up that roof line. You do have to, watch out for little bugs and things in your moss. If you keep this outside where it can stay a little bit damp, that moss will last for a long time. Even inside, it tends to dry with still having like a greenish tint to it, so it still looks good. You do want to be careful moving your fairy house because with the rocks just being held on by the hot glue, you do tend to knock them loose if you move it a lot. So generally you just want to find a spot to leave it. If you have any questions, you can see I added in some of my seashells and my gems around in the different spots. You could put windows in, you could cover up this bottom platform. I'm going to set mine right down in the garden so that'll be covered, and you won't see that. It will eventually start to break down outside too, depending on kind of if you have it in a sheltered area, it'll last a little bit longer. But most of the materials on here are natural materials, so it's okay for that to kind of go back into the soil. If you do have any questions, comment below. I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you so much for joining us for today's craft, and I will see you next week.